In this Jordan B. Peterson podcast, Jordan Peterson is joined by Dr. Miriam Grossman, a physician, author, and public speaker who is concerned about the experimental treatments and dangerous ideologies being promoted in the psychiatry profession, especially regarding children. Dr. Grossman explains that children are being taught a belief system or ideology of gender where they are told that gender is separate from sex, and they can have a gender that is at odds with their physical reality. This idea is dangerous as it can lead to confusion and destabilization of identity. Dr. Grossman has been concerned about this issue for a long time, and she wrote about it in her book, You're Teaching My Child What? In 2009. Dr. Grossman has learned about the risks of the experimental treatments being promoted by the medical profession, which can lead to the loss of body parts, sterility, lowered voice, decreased bone density, increased probability of cancer, trauma to the family, regret, and many other negative side effects. Despite these risks, many people are being led to believe that these treatments will bring them euphoria and have no negative consequences. Dr. Grossman urges people to take responsibility, put their lives together, and develop a vision for themselves instead of blindly accepting dangerous ideologies or treatments. Miriam Grossman, MD, discusses the case of David Reimer, a boy who was raised as a girl after experiencing a botched circumcision. Reimer became the subject of a study led by Dr. John Money, who claimed that gender was a social construct and that the child's gender identity would align with how he was raised. Miriam Grossman notes that Dr. Money followed the twins every year and reported that the child, given the name Brenda, was adjusting well and thriving as a girl. Money's theory gained widespread attention and became accepted in many scientific fields, leading to many boys with ambiguous genitalia being raised as girls. However, the experiment ultimately failed, as Brenda, now known as David, revealed the truth and stated that he had identified as male since childhood. David Reimer struggled with being raised as a girl and exhibited masculine behaviors such as wanting to play with his brother's toys, urinating standing up, and being aggressive. He and his twin brother eventually stopped going to Dr. Money's clinic and later committed suicide as adults. The podcast hosts also discuss how Dr. Money was intolerant of challenges to his theory and used his influence to suppress opposing voices in the scientific community. This case highlights the dangers of allowing ideology to influence scientific research and the importance of considering multiple perspectives and conducting rigorous research. Dr. Grossman discusses how Dr. Paul McHugh, who worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital and had studied the results of sex reassignment surgeries, closed down Dr. Money's clinic and wrote about the importance of paying attention to the psyches of individuals who experience gender dysphoria rather than altering their bodies. However, the damage had already been done and gender identity theory became a widely accepted concept in sex education, sociology, and psychology. Dr. Grossman brings up a book called My Gender Workbook, published in 1998. Which challenges the gender binary and was recommended by professional mental health organizations despite the fact that gender dysphoria was still considered a disorder at the time. She argues that such a book an individual, like Kate Bornstein, who authored it, and had a controversial gender journey, promoted an enticing narrative for teenagers to fight against societal oppression and break free from gender restrictions, even though it was not based in sound medical or psychological research. Money's assertion that gender is a social construct was taken as the gold standard by the psychiatric and psychological professions, leading to a misguided path toward gender-affirming treatments. However, David Reimer's case proved that this experiment couldn't have gone more catastrophically wrong than it did. Reimer committed suicide, and his twin brother died of an opiate overdose before him. The entire family was traumatized by the events as it was a terrible disaster. The legacy of John Money wasn't acknowledged as he falsified data and intentionally lied about the outcomes of the experiment. This not only perverted the culture but also led to the death of 2 people and the ruin of a family. Furthermore, by 1998, John Money's theories were considered less radical than newer ideas, which claimed that gender was a fluid concept that existed on a spectrum. Grossman argues that it would be easy to defeat Money's theories with the science we have now and that we know that gender is not only determined by society but is also influenced by biology. They discuss the biological and physiological differences between male and female bodies that go beyond just genitalia. They explain that every cell in the body, except for those without a nucleus, is stamped male or female, and this can manifest in different perceptual and temperamental patterns that are sex-typed to a large degree. They also discuss the idea that social rules assigned to men and women are not arbitrary, but rather influenced by biology. The conversation then shifts to the topic of children, and the idea that powerful medications and hormones can be used to deny biology, and create a persona of the opposite sex without consequences. They argue that this is a lie being told to both children and parents, and that the risks and challenges posed by these treatments are significant and potentially lifelong. Finally, They discuss the increasing rates of gender dysphoria in the past decade and why it is important for all parents to be aware of what is going on in schools and to have a realistic understanding of the risks associated with these treatments. Grossman emphasizes that this is not just a concern for parents with children with gender dysphoria, but for all parents, as the trend of denying biology and promoting gender fluidity has become widespread in schools and popular culture. Dr. Grossman highlights that studies have shown an increasing number of high school students, particularly in urban areas, identify as non-binary. She emphasizes that parents need to be aware, and the charge of fear-mongering is not accurate as currently there is no long-term data available on the consequences of major life changes such as surgeries. Furthermore, those who regret such surgeries do not go back to the clinics, and no one is keeping statistics on them. Dr. Grossman notes this cancel culture is devastating, as seen with people being mobbed for expressing opinions that are not in accordance with the radical leftist ideology. The guest also talks about her experience of being marginalized while working at UCLA after publishing her book called Unprotected in 2008, where she challenged the political correctness of the student health clinic. She explains that her experiences as a child of Holocaust survivors and her faith have motivated her to stand up for truth and protect young people from the darkness of lies. Dr. Grossman mentions her book You're Teaching My Children What and her upcoming book Lost in Translation, a child psychiatrist's guide out of madness, and her appearance in Matt Walsh's documentary What is a Woman? Peterson commends her for being a voice of reason and common sense in a field that has become characterized by ideological dogma and political correctness. Peterson acknowledges the frustration that many parents feel in trying to navigate the complexities of modern-day mental health care and the need for evidence-based approaches to therapy. He suggests that the tide is turning in countries like the UK, where the closure of the Tavistock Clinic has sparked a re-evaluation of gender-affirming medical treatments for children and adolescents. He expresses hope that other Western countries, including the US and Canada, will follow suit and abandon harmful medical practices that do not have a basis in sound science. Jordan Peterson also brings up the importance of the fundamental perceptual categories of male and female for people's identity. Peterson argues that the category system of male and female is as fundamental as up or down, black and white or light and dark. However, the increasing number of choices, including the option to deny reality, have created anxiety rather than freedom among young people. This, in turn, has caused the rates of depression and anxiety to skyrocket among them, especially young women who are more likely to fall prey to psychological epidemics. The guest and the host emphasize that identity is not merely subjective and based on what people feel but a framework of attentional prioritization and action that enables people to function well in natural and social environments. The identity should be integrated with other people, which makes it a socially negotiated construct. Thus, merely relying on what one feels as their identity is not only impractical but also unethical from a clinical perspective. Miriam Grossman discusses the dangers of the current trend of gender questioning and how it impacts not only the individual but also their parents. Grossman argues that the mental health profession is not providing adequate support to these parents and is in fact demonizing them for questioning the gender affirmation process. She shares a story of a support group for parents who have recently had their children come out as transgender or gender neutral and highlights the trauma they experience due to the lack of validation for their concerns. Grossman also critiques the American Psychological Association's guidelines for gender-affirming care, stating that they contradict themselves by claiming there is no long-term evidence of its success and yet asserting that transitioning is essential to prevent poor mental health outcomes. She further notes that medical and counseling professionals have been lying to parents about the risks associated with gender-affirming care due to current legislation. Grossman argues that gender dysphoria is often an extension of underlying mental health issues and that transitioning does not necessarily address the root causes of these disorders. Grossman highlights the destabilizing and destructive impact that this ideology has on families, as it leads to a huge ripple effect on people. Parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins are all impacted. Grossman speaks about how parents have trauma and are grieving as a result of their child falling into the gender ideology pit. She compares this trauma to a scene from the iconic movie Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett O'Hara is panicked and running through a makeshift hospital on a train station's grounds with hundreds and thousands of injured, moaning, bleeding soldiers. Grossman says that the parents are the casualties also, and their anguish is not being acknowledged except by each other and these secret groups that they have. Therefore, about a year and a half ago, Grossman felt compelled to speak to these parents, not just individually but as a group. She spoke to parents of rapid-onset gender dysphoria, ROGED, kids, who have fallen into the gender ideology trap through social contagion. She acknowledged the genuine post-traumatic stress disorder that these parents are going through, along with real grief from their losses. In her talks, she wanted to recognize the horror, trauma, and grief that these parents are dealing with, which her profession is overlooking, and that most mainstream authorities have abandoned these parents and their children. Peterson asks Grossman about the fact that high-level governing bodies and associations, such as the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, and the Endocrine Society, have announced their full support for all the presuppositions that are producing this psychological epidemic. Grossman does not directly answer this question and shifts the discussion to highlight the need to see the parent's trauma and grief, which the mainstream authorities have not acknowledged. She acknowledges that parents experience serious losses when their child undergoes medical procedures like mastectomies or genital surgeries that result in sterilization. Additionally, their grief is often disenfranchised, which makes it difficult to live with and heal from. Many parents are afraid to speak out about their grief and are often isolated, whispering in their cars or basements. Furthermore, their grief is demonized in the current political and ideological climate. If parents oppose the idea of their child undergoing gender transition, they are often labeled as bigoted, exclusionary, or worse. This makes it difficult for parents to receive the necessary support and guidance from institutions, such as hospitals or schools. She suggests that there is no consensus on how to adequately take care of children who are questioning or confused about their gender identity. This is because there is an all-out war going on at a professional level that is not being covered outside conservative media. Grossman notes that countries such as Finland, Sweden, and England have made a 180-degree turn on this issue, meaning children cannot access puberty blockers and testosterone unless they are part of a study that closely monitors them. On the other hand, children in the United States can walk into Planned Parenthood and receive blockers after just half an hour. Grossman suggests that this ease of access to treatments can lead children down a path towards surgery without proper counseling or understanding of the long-term effects. Grossman explains that she wrote about gender education in her 2009 book but did not expect the issue to explode in the way it has. She notes that children are being taught through sex education using tax dollars that gender is a social construct and that it is oppressive to believe in the binary concept of male and female. Grossman delves further into the topic of gender, and Peterson asks her to talk about John Money. She also notes that while everyone is concerned about the suicide rates among children who are questioning their gender identity, no one is talking about the parents who are experiencing suicidal ideation because of their child's gender identity crisis. These parents are struggling with the loss of their child's previous identity and the uncertainty of their future relevance in their child's life. Grossman suggests that this particular issue is worse than anything these parents have faced before and is driving some to take medication and seek psychiatric help. She states that parents need to be proactive and educated about this belief system. Grossman highlights the nightmare that families go through when Child Protective Services (CPS) shows up at their doorstep, accusing them of child abuse and threatening them with the removal of other children from the family. She discusses the systematic capture of respectable institutions and how the medical community has become cowardly and derelict in their duty to not speak out against gender ideology. Grossman explains the origins of gender identity theory, tracing it back to John Money, who believed that gender identity is completely separate from biology and that everything else is a social construct. Dr. Miriam Grossman and Peterson discuss the work of John Money, an expert in the field of hermaphrodites who developed a theory of gender identity that became very influential in the second half of the 20th century. Money's theory suggested that gender was not biologically determined, but rather a social construct that could be shaped and influenced by upbringing and environment. However, it turns out that Money had a personal history that might have influenced his theory. He had a traumatic childhood and a deeply troubled relationship with his own masculinity, which may have led him to develop a theory that would comfort him by allowing him to externalize his own gender dysphoria as a sociological phenomenon rather than an internal psychological one. Peterson notes that Money's theory was a convenient way for him to avoid dealing with his own internal struggles, by externalizing them and viewing gender as something that can be socially constructed, rather than something innate. This, according to Peterson, is similar to the way that trans activists rationalize their decisions, by insisting that trans identity is common and that society must accept it without question. They discuss the story of John Money, who opened the first clinic in the United States for hermaphrodite treatment. The surgeries performed involved castration, which leads to the theme of gender reassignment. Grossman notes that Money was very pompous and self-assured, calling the shots and appearing to know what was going on. She describes Money's theory that being male or female is completely separate from biology. The story follows the Reamer family, who had a tragedy in that they gave birth to twin boys, one of which had phimosis and was recommended to undergo circumcision. During the operation, a malfunction resulted in the child's penis being burnt beyond functionality. Seeing John Money on television, the Reamer family decided to visit him in Baltimore, where Bruce, the boy with a burnt penis, was castrated and given some form of elementary female genitalia. Money instructed the Reamer family to raise Bruce as a girl and never tell him about the operation. Grossman suggests that on some level, money was helping the little boys by castrating them and making them into girls. Unfortunately, Bruce's gender assignment was disastrous, and his quality of life was marred by gender dysphoria, depression, and ultimately suicide. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.